Please don't hang up. I can't see anything. The lights are out and my daughter's shaking. I just need someone. Jay Carter had no business answering unknown numbers at 3:04 a.m. Not on a storm-soaked Friday when his only plan was to sleep through the thunder and maybe fix the leaky kitchen faucet in the morning. But something in that voice frayed, desperate, and barely holding on reached into him and didn't let go. He sat on the edge of his twin bed, call log still glowing on his cracked screen. Private number, just 2 words, but the voice behind them sounded like it belonged to a woman who hadn't asked for help in a long time, the kind who only called when there was no one else left. Lightning cracked through the sky outside his window, momentarily illuminating the tools on his workbench and the faded photograph of a boy himself at 6 alone on a swing set, eyes hollow beneath a hand-me-down hoodie. He remembered the night his foster mom locked the front door too early. He remembered sleeping on the porch, waiting for someone who never came back. He wouldn't let someone else feel that. Jay threw on his work boots, grabbed his jacket, and slid into his old Ford pickup. The rain was pounding like it meant something, washing the city in heavy sheets as he pulled out of his narrow driveway in East Nashville and followed the map to an address spoken in a panic, 1216 Gladeview Lane. The neighborhood was unfamiliar suburban, quiet, unnervingly still for a storm like this. The kind of place where porches had rocking chairs but no one ever waved. As he pulled up, he saw a flicker of candlelight through the window of the first-floor apartment. He knocked. Silence. Then the door cracked open, revealing a woman in her early 30s barefoot, wearing a stretched gray sweater and yoga pants. Her brown hair was pulled into a loose bun, damp at the edges. Her eyes were red-rimmed and confused. "You're not with emergency services," she said, blinking hard. "No, ma'am," Jay replied, gentle. "But I got your call." She swallowed. Her lips trembled. "I meant to call the utility hotline. Or maybe 911, I don't even know anymore. My kid, she's 6. She has sensory issues. The dark, she panics." "I understand," Jay said. "Is she okay now?" The woman hesitated, then stepped aside. Inside, the air was thick with wax and worry. A small girl sat under the dining table, hugging a stuffed dinosaur with frayed seams. Her body rocked gently as she muttered something under her breath. "That's Lila," the woman whispered. "And I'm Heather Monroe." Jay knelt down near the table, careful not to come too close. "Hey there, Lila. I'm Jay. Your mom called because she needed a little help. That okay with you?" Lila looked up for a second. Her lips parted, but no words came. She went back to rocking. "I brought a flashlight," Jay said, "and some backup batteries. Maybe I can check your fuse box too?" Heather nodded. "It's in the hallway, past the pantry." Jay walked the apartment like he'd been there before, quiet, respectful, not touching more than he needed to. The breaker had tripped hard. He flipped it, and the hallway buzzed back to life. The kitchen light blinked uncertainly but stayed on. Heather exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for an hour. "Thank you," she murmured. Jay gave a small nod. "No trouble. I've had to do this plenty." "You always show up for strangers at 3 a.m.? He shrugged. "Sometimes strangers sound like someone I used to be." They stood there for a moment, the silence between them filled with rain tapping the windows and the faint hum of a refrigerator rebooting. Heather turned toward the stove. "I was going to make tea before the power died. I don't have much, but would you like to stay a few minutes? Just until Lila falls asleep again." Jay looked at the girl still under the table, her rocking slower now, more like a rhythm than a panic. He smiled gently. "Yeah, I can stay a little while." Jay didn't mean to come back the next night, but something about the way Heather had stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand wrapped around her chipped mug, the other resting absent-mindedly on the counter, as if she hadn't had adult company in years, stayed with him longer than he expected. He found himself at the same apartment complex the following evening, holding a small toolbox and a paper bag of groceries. "For the flickering kitchen light," he said, shrugging. "And I figured Lila might like the dinosaur-shaped macaroni." Heather gave him a look that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't refusal either. And just like that, the door opened again. Over the next week, Jay returned sometimes to fix things, sometimes just to listen. Lila grew used to his voice, then his presence. She even offered him her green crayon one night, whispering, "He's the dino doctor," pointing to her drawing. Heather had chuckled, and for the first time since they met, Jay saw how pretty her laugh lines were when they weren't worn down by worry. But behind the slow-growing comfort was something else, something unspoken. Heather never talked about Lila's father. Jay never asked. He could sense it. There was a heaviness in certain silences, like her eyes flinching when the mail slot clattered, or the way she always checked the lock twice before going to bed. One evening, while fixing the cabinet door in the hallway, Jay noticed a stack of unopened letters tucked behind the microwave. Legal documents, custody warnings. The top one had bold red ink. Final notice. He didn't mention it. Instead, he started asking about Heather, about who she was before the panic, the sleepless nights, the crumpled emergency bills. She told him she once wanted to teach music, that her mother had passed away when Lila was born, and since then, it felt like she'd been swimming upstream alone. "I used to sing," she said softly one night. "But now, it's like my voice only comes out in whispers." Jay nodded. He knew that feeling too well. Still, life had a way of interrupting quiet rebuilding. One night, just as Lila fell asleep curled up beside Jay on the couch while watching old Disney VHS tapes, there was a knock on the door. Not soft, not gentle. A hard, deliberate knock that echoed through the floorboards. Heather froze. Jay stood, shielding the little girl unconsciously. Heather went to the door. When she opened it just a crack, a man's voice slipped through smooth, calculated, with just a hint of menace. "Heather, we need to talk. You've been ignoring me." Jay stood up, slowly. Heather's knuckles whitened on the doorknob. "Now's not a good time, Travis." Travis. The name carried a history that didn't need explaining. Jay stepped forward, close enough that the man on the other side could hear him. "She said now's not a good time," he said calmly. Silence, then a low chuckle. "And who the hell are you?" Jay didn't answer. Heather shut the door firmly, but not fast enough to miss the tension in her shoulders. Her face was pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the chain lock. "That's him, isn't it?" Jay asked gently. Heather nodded once, eyes glistening. "He said he wants custody. Says I'm unstable. That I leave Lila with strangers she's been watching." Jay clenched his fists. Over the next few days, the rhythm changed. Lila became more quiet again. Heather kept her curtains closed, double-checked the locks, and walked with her shoulders hunched like the past had moved back into the apartment. Jay didn't push, but he stayed. He fixed the porch light. He made dinner. He sat with Heather after Lila fell asleep and told her stories about his own childhood, about how nobody ever stayed. Until one foster mom with a garden and gospel records finally taught him how to believe people could. And then, one afternoon, Jay came by early just as the school bus was letting off. He spotted Travis across the street in a silver SUV, window down, sunglasses on, watching. That was the moment Jay realized. This wasn't just a mistake or an ex with bad timing. This was a man building a case, a trap, a narrative. Heather wasn't paranoid. She was being hunted. Jay drove straight to his cousin Maurice, a lawyer who owed him more than a few favors. "I need to know how to help a woman whose ex is playing dirty," he said. Maurice raised an eyebrow. "You falling for this woman, Jay?" Jay didn't answer. That night, Heather sat at the kitchen table reading a letter from family court. Travis had filed for emergency custody based on alleged neglect and inappropriate male presence. Heather's face crumpled. "They'll take her," she whispered. "They'll believe him." "No," Jay said, his voice low but steady. "Not if we fight back. Not if we prove what kind of man he really is." Heather looked up, blinking through tears. "Why are you doing this, Jay? You barely know us." He hesitated, then reached out, placing his hand over hers. "Because no one ever showed up for me when I needed them, but I can show up for you now." And in that moment, storm quiet for once. Lila sleeping safe. The kitchen bathed in warm lamplight. Something shifted. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. It was a choice, a war they were about to fight together. The morning of the custody hearing arrived under a gray Savannah sky, the kind that seemed to press down on your shoulders like the weight of unspoken truths. Heather stood in front of the mirror in the borrowed navy blazer Jay had found at a church donation drive. Her hands trembled slightly as she fixed her hair. Lila sat on the edge of the bed in her Sunday dress, clutching the worn plush dino Jay had duct-taped back together days earlier. Jay stood by the window, watching the courthouse across the street, his jaw tight. "They're not going to take her," he said, not as a question, but as a vow. "Zzz, zzz, zzz." Inside the courtroom, the walls felt colder than they looked. Travis sat at the plaintiff's table, clean-shaven, tie perfectly straight, a polished performance. Beside him, his lawyer read over statements that painted Heather as unstable, reckless, unsafe. Heather sat small beside her appointed advocate, trying to find courage in a world that had so often stolen it from her. Lila had to wait outside with a court liaison. When Jay was called as a witness, the judge, an older black woman with eyes like cracked slat, raised an eyebrow. "You are not a relative of the child?" "No, ma'am," Jay said, voice steady. "But I'm the man who showed up when no one else did." He told them about the night of the wrong call, the asthma attack, the flickering lights, about how he'd seen Heather care for Lila with fierce, exhausted love. He described Travis's car parked across the street, the intimidation, the surveillance. Then he reached into his pocket and handed the clerk a USB drive. Security footage from the building across the street. Travis parked there, 4 nights in a row, just watching. No reason to be there. The judge's expression shifted barely but enough. Heather's lawyer stood and added one last piece. A notarized letter from Maurice, outlining the manipulation tactics Travis had used in 2 prior relationships, cases sealed but documented. The courtroom went still. Then Travis stood too quickly. His voice rose. "You people don't know her. She's just a waitress. Wowho uses men like this loser to make herself look stable." Silence. Heather stood too. And this time, her voice didn't shake. "I am a waitress. And I'm a mother. But the difference between you and Jay Aish never tried to control me. He just showed up. You used fear. He used kindness." The judge looked down, then back up. "I've heard enough." The gavel fell. Temporary full custody awarded to Heather. Supervised visits only for Travis pending review. Outside the courthouse, Heather broke down not in sobs, but in a long, quiet exhale as if she'd been holding her breath for years. Lila ran to her. Jay knelt down to let the little girl jump into his arms too. That evening, they didn't celebrate with champagne or fancy dinners. Just frozen pizza on paper plates, laughter echoing off the walls, and an old gospel record spinning in the background, one Jay hadn't heard since he was 10. Later that night, after Lila had fallen asleep, Heather joined Jay on the porch. The warm southern night wrapped around them, and she whispered, "You saved us." Jay shook his head. You saved yourself. I just held the light so you could see the way." They sat in silence for a while. Then Heather said something he'd never forget. "Justice doesn't always wear a robe, Jay. Sometimes, it's just someone who doesn't leave." And in the quiet glow of porch light and grace, they finally stopped running, not from each other, not from the past. And for once, the world outside seemed to slow down just enough to let them begin again. Months passed. Savannah's autumn came gently, draping the city in amber leaves and soft winds, as if the earth itself had taken a breath. Heather, now working part-time at the Community Arts Center, stood in front of a classroom full of wide-eyed children, teaching them how to sculpt clay with patience and heart. Lila attended school every morning with her favorite purple backpack and a quiet joy in her step. Jay had picked up weekend gigs playing piano at a local supper club. They weren't rich, not even close, but peace, that rarest currency, had begun to bloom in their home. One Friday afternoon, as Jay helped Lila with her math homework, a knock came at the door. Heather opened it to find a man in a gray suital, clean-shaven, with the kind of polished calm that screamed power. He introduced himself as Anthony Callahan, senior partner at Harlan and Bryce, a corporate law firm out of Atlanta. "You don't know me," he said, "but someone I respect deeply sent me your way. Maurice Jefferson." Heather's heart paused. "Maurice? He's been gone since." "Yes, but before he passed, he wrote you a letter." The man handed her a sealed envelope, thick and yellowed at the edges. Inside, in Maurice's careful scrawl, was the truth. How he'd once made the mistake of trusting Travis, how he'd watched him manipulate and destroy. But more importantly, he wrote how Heather reminded him of his sister, quiet but fierce, kind but unbending, and how Jay, in Maurice's words, was the kind of man this country needs more of, not loud, not rich, but present, the ones who just show up. The final line read, "Give this family the chance I never took for my own." Anthony continued. Maurice arranged a trust fund, not massive, but enough. For Lila's schooling, a stable home, and legal support should Travis ever try again. Heather stood stunned, tears welling. Why? Why would he do that? Because, Anthony said, in this world, the loudest men are often the wrong ones. Maurice saw something worth protecting, and now it's our turn. The next week, Heather and Jay moved into a modest house in the Starland district, surrounded by old trees and neighbors who waved from their porches. Jay set up a second-hand upright piano in the living room. On the wall above it, they hung a framed copy of Maurice's final letter. At Lila's school play, she stood on stage as a small sunbeam in a cardboard costume, but when she spotted Jay in the audience, she lit up like the real thing. "That's my dad," she whispered proudly to the girl next to her. Jay smiled, but deeper than pride, there was something else, something sacred. In the quiet of that night, after the play, Heather sat beside him on the couch. "You never owed us anything," she said. "You could have walked away." Jay turned to her, his voice low. "Sometimes the wrong call is the right call in disguise. I didn't save anyone. I just showed up when the world expected silence." And as the wind rustled outside and the night folded around their home like a blanket, there was no need for grand endings. Just this, the rhythm of breathing in peace, the echo of quiet justice, and the knowing that some stories don't need a spotlight to shine. They just need to be lived. The first cold front of November had rolled through Savannah, bringing with it that crisp air only Southerners understood, sharp and edged with the scent of pine. Heather stood in the kitchen, chopping sweet potatoes for dinner, when a shadow crossed the glass of the front door. 3 soft knocks, no doorbell. Jay opened it with Lila peeking from behind his legs. There, in the glow of the porch light, stood a man, clean suit, gray overcoat, and an old-fashioned leather briefcase. He looked out of place in their modest neighborhood, like someone who had stepped off a boardroom floor and mistakenly landed on a quiet street. His face was familiar, but it took Heather a few seconds to place him. "Anthony Callahan," he said, voice calm but firm. "I work with Harlan and Bryce Law. May I come in?" Heather exchanged a glance with Jay before nodding slowly. They moved to the living room Lila sent upstairs with her coloring book, Jay standing at Heather's side like a quiet wall. Callahan set the briefcase down but didn't open it yet. Before Maurice Jefferson passed, he made several legal arrangements, and he left a personal letter. "For you." He reached inside his coat and handed Heather a thick envelope, yellowing slightly, sealed with a blue wax stamp. Heather opened it with trembling fingers. The paper inside carried Maurice's distinctive handwriting, sharp, dignified, like the man himself. His words were raw, unguarded. He admitted his guilt, not in what he'd done, but in what he hadn't stopped. He had known about Travis's dealings. He had ignored the warning signs because it benefited him. He had watched as Travis manipulated contracts, siphoned assets, and smeared good people, Heather and her father among them. But something changed the day Jay showed up at his property. Maurice had been awake, watching from the window when Jay carried Lila in his arms through the storm. A stranger answering a call that wasn't his. That moment haunted Maurice. It reminded him of who he used to be, before money twisted his instincts. That night, he began making changes, quiet ones. Heather's hands shook as she read the final paragraph. "This world doesn't reward the quiet. It often chews up the gentle and worships the cunning. But if you're reading this, it means the quiet won. You won." Callahan finally opened the briefcase and pulled out documents. A small trust for Lila, a transfer deed for a modest property Maurice had once used as a summer retreat, and legal protections to shield them from any future retaliation by Travis or his associates. "You don't owe anything in return," he said. Maurice asked for one thing only: raise Lila with the dignity he failed to show his own son. Heather looked to Jay, the man who had once been a stranger, who now stood more solid in her life than anyone ever had. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The following days moved like a slow-motion dream. They packed their apartment, said goodbye to neighbors. Jay sold his truck to buy a small used sedan that fit Lila's booster seat better. And one evening, just after sunset, they moved into the new house Maurice had left Thema, white single-story home nestled beneath towering oak trees draped in Spanish moss. There was silence that night, not emptiness, peace. And when Jay tucked Leela into bed, she whispered, "Daddy, are we gonna stay here forever?" Jay kissed her forehead. "As long as you want, sunshine." Down the hall, Heather read Maurice's letter one more time. She folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box, next to an old photograph of her father smiling with dusty hands after a long day's work. Justice hadn't come in a courtroom. It hadn't come with applause or headlines. It had come quietly, through a stranger in the doorway, through a letter that spoke what couldn't be undone, through a man who simply showed up and stayed. 2 years later, the porch light still burned each night outside the small white house in Savannah. It wasn't just habit, it was a quiet symbol, a signal that someone was always home, always waiting. Jay never said much about it, but every evening at dusk, he made sure it was on. By now, the neighborhood knew them. Jay, the soft-spoken music teacher at St. Mary's Community Center. Heather, the single mom-turned-local volunteer who helped other women navigate legal aid and social services. And Lilathy, sunshine of the block, now in 2nd grade, always with a glittery notebook and 1,000 questions. But that peace hadn't come without shadows. Travis Harlan, stripped of his influence, had vanished after the investigations began. While the papers labeled it as a retirement abroad, Heather knew better. The man who once held her family in a legal chokehold had been quietly ousted. He still sent the occasional sharp-tongued letter through lawyers, veiled threats wrapped in legal jargon, but none of them landed anymore. The walls Maurice had put in place before his death were holding strong. And still, Heather waited for the other shoe to drop. Trauma doesn't announce itself when it returns, it just sits at the dinner table like it never left. One morning, while Jay was tuning guitars for his students, Heather received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her early 60s, neatly dressed, silver hair pulled back, eyes weary but kind. "I'm June Callahan," she said, voice soft. "Anthony was my husband." Heather froze. "Was?" June nodded. "He passed last winter. Lung cancer." Heather stepped aside to let her in. They sat with tea and silence at first. Then June pulled a worn leather folder from her bag. "My husband told me about you and Jay, and Maurice's letter," she said. "After he passed, I found this in his office. He never mailed it, but he meant to. I think you should read it." Inside was another letter from Anthony. In it, he wrote not as a lawyer but as a father. He spoke of redemption, of how one Momenta man showing up at 3 a.m. to help a child not his own had changed his view of what justice looked like. He mentioned the pain he saw in Jay's eyes during their meetings, and how fiercely Heather protected her daughter. "That's what a real legacy is," he wrote. "Not money, not titles. It's what we leave behind in people. I hope my wife finds you one day and gives you this, just so you know your story changed mine." Heather wiped her eyes. June didn't speak. She just took Heather's hand and squeezed it. That night, Jay found her sitting on the porch steps, letter in hand. He didn't ask. He just sat beside her. "You ever think," Heather said quietly, "that all of this, everything that went wrong, the calls, the storm, it was never a mistake?" Jay looked up at the porch light. "Sometimes the wrong road is the only one that leads you home." Inside, Lila's laughter echoed down the hallway. She was making peanut butter sandwiches for an imaginary tea party. Her voice called out, "Daddy, are you coming?" Jay stood, brushing off his jeans. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Heather watched him go, her heart full not because everything was perfect, but because everything finally made sense. The pain, the detours, the quiet wins. As the last light faded from the sky, she turned on the porch light again, just in case someone out there was lost, looking for the right door to knock on.